Go ahead and stop sharing. Jay, you want to tell us about visual calculations and why they're so great and how they're going to help us with our DAX code?
For sure. I'd love to. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Can you quickly confirm you can see my screen, Tim?
Yes, I can
Cool.
see your presentation.
Awesome. Well, thanks all. Thanks all for being here. Thanks all for making the time out of your busy schedules. And really appreciate you showing up here and being part of the Power BI community. So I am Jeroen. I go by Jay because I blame my parents. They gave me a very Dutch name that nobody can pronounce. So please feel free to call me Jay. Don't worry about my last name even. Let's not get started over that on that. And I work on the Power BI team, and I am a product manager over there. Um, Almost 4 years now. 15 years with Microsoft, but 4 years in the Power BI product team. And I mostly focus on the programming language that many people love to hate, which is called DAX. You might know. You might have heard about that a little, maybe sometimes when you work with Power BI, you might see it. And that's kind of like my bread and butter. That's what I work on. That's what I'm trying to think about. I own a couple more things, but this is the big one for me. So yeah, that's basically where I am, what I do and what I work on. So if you ever want to reach out to me, here's some ways to find me on social media. I have some handles with JPowerBI on the various social media platforms. And then here's my email address. So feel free to send me a note at any time or reach out on Teams or whatever you prefer. Always happy to chat. Now, what I wanted to cover today is really something that we've been working on for 3 years now, I think. Which is really set at making DAX easier. So that's really where we're going to start talking about today. And I hope it's going to be an exciting and interesting meetup. But feel free to jump in, ask your question in the chat, as Tim said, or use Q&A. And then I'll also might ask you to unmute yourself if I don't really understand the question or there's a further explanation we need to have. I want this to be your time. I can run through all my slides, of course I can, but if there's other stuff that you want me to answer, maybe you've already seen visual calcs, what we're going to talk about a little bit in different setting. Maybe you have some follow-up questions. I really want to use that time, our time together for that, and not just run through the classic thing that I've done a couple times now. So if the group wants to go in somewhere else to a slightly different, deeper level than the introductory level on this topic, we can definitely do it. But just guide me through your questions, okay? For now, I'll just start level set everybody, and then we'll see where it takes us. Cool. So let me just make sure that I have my keyboard turned off, because sometimes that thing does something weird with PowerPoint and then just runs through all the slides really quick. That's probably a bug somewhere. That happens. So I just plug the thing off, and then, I learned. Cool. So let's get started. So let's use the raise hand feature in Teams. You have the little hand there at the top where you can raise your hand. So who here has never ever struggled writing DAX from scratch and made it? You were able to write any DAX you wanted, and it always worked the first try, and it gave you the results you wanted. Who's so full of themselves that they would claim that? I don't think any hand would go up, and I'm choosing a different question just to trip Mr. Darrell here on the call, because yesterday he was on a call with me where I asked the reverse question to raise your hand if you struggled. So now I'm asking you if you raise your hand if you never struggled. Well, right. And that's true, right? All of us, we always struggle. I mean, DAX is really complicated. Most people think DAX is really complicated, and it's really a testament to the quality of the rest of the product that if DAX is really that complicated, that we are in this leadership position that we are with Power BI today, right? So, and DAX is really complicated. It sounds simple, and it starts off simple because it looks like Excel formulas. So then people go like, oh yeah, I can do this. Oh yeah, the sum, an average. Oh yeah, that's easy. It's just like Excel. And then suddenly, bam, the complexity of DAX hits you. You see calculate, you see things about context transition and filter context and row context, and how does that even work? And then you get all these all and all selected and kind of weird functions. You go like, I don't know what they do. The name sounds really weird and I'm not very descriptive of what they do. And that's really the struggle that people are in. So today, how most people write DAX is like this, right? You find some DAX somewhere, community forum, social media, a blog, Microsoft's documentation, the books, right? This one, famous, by the two Italians, of course, Russo and Ferrari. This one, no, not that one. Sorry, wrong book. This one. This one I have to show because it's Dutch, two Dutch MVPs that wrote it. So I, proud Dutchman as I am, I have to show that one. But these are the books, right? So you run through them, and there's other books as well, but these are the ones that I happen to have here. So you run through them, you might read them, and you go like, yeah, I don't understand what this is about. You read the chapter again and again and again and once more, and then you still don't get it. At least that's where I am. And I'm the PM owner of DAX at Microsoft, and I don't get all of this. That's a problem, right? And you find something in here, you go like, yeah, that might be the solution I need, and you copy paste it, or you look at it and you type it, and then you press enter and you, I don't know, cross your fingers or invoke some higher deity if you want to, or if that's something you're so inclined. You don't have to, it's totally optional, and you hope for the best. And sometimes it works. But are you really in control? Are you really capable of making the changes you might need to tweak that thing to exactly what you need? Do you understand the DAX that you just used? Are you comfortable tweaking it? Troubleshooting it? The answer is most likely no. That's not good. So that's one problem. It is not easy. Second, some things that you would expect to be very easy are really hard in DAX. And that is stuff that you feel like is basic understanding of math is required to do those kind of things, like a running sum. Your manager might have asked you to do a running sum. It's something that is not rocket science, it's basic understanding of math that you need. You just need the ability to add two numbers, do that all over, start at the top, end at the bottom, add numbers. You don't need subtraction, division, or whatever. Just addition, which any kid learns. The first thing they do about math is learn addition. They need to learn that, and then you can do a running sum. It is not hard. You can do it in Excel with one simple click, drag and drop. You can write it on a piece of paper. And then here's the leading self-service analytics tool. And doing a running sum is really hard, because if you start searching for it, you will quickly find doing a running total in DAX. And here's a website that lists 21 steps to doing a running total in DAX. Let that sink in for a second. 21. That's 20 steps too many, right? We're not talking rocket science here. This is basic stuff. And why is this so hard? Well, because there's a core problem here. It's really hard to make DAX refer back to what came before me, or vice versa, what comes after me in my calculation. That is almost impossible in DAX. It's possible, but it's really hard to do. So that's a problem. Somebody has their mic, by the way, unmuted. I'm not sure if you should mute them, Tim. Maybe you can check. I see the little speech bubble. So that's another problem, right? So let's face it, DAX is really hard. To be exact, filter context and context transition are really hard. Referring back to something that came before me is really hard. And that's surprisingly really hard. And it's weird that we got this far with DAX being so hard, our core programming language being so hard. And then the other problem is DAX calculations, the measures you make, are scoped to the model, right? DAX, like the whole Power BI thing, is built based on a data model, right? If you start thinking about Power BI as a pipeline, there's raw data from the source. You do some transformations, maybe in Power Query or what have you, and then you load all that things into a data model. That's where you have multiple tables, relationships, and everything else. Great. And then that is where you define your calculations. They live on that level, on that data model. That means a measure that gets executed, when it gets executed, it is executed in scope of whatever happens to be the context in the data model. And that's what we call the filter context. So you wrote your measure, sum of sales amount. Nowhere in that expression do you describe the context you expect. Nowhere can you see the context that is being set. But when it gets executed, there is context. And that context is being set by the filters, the slicers, whatever other queries might be floating around here with all the tables and relationships. That all defines in what environment, if you will, that measure is being executed. And that's an n-dimensional problem because we don't show you that context. We don't tell you in advance what it's going to be. There's no way for you to validate that context unless you want to do a lot of hard work. So you really have to be very defensive in your DAX writing to make sure you actually check for the right context so you give the right return value so you can guarantee the right results. That's a problem. And then the other one is what I already explained, is typical business type calculations are so hard to do, it's mind-boggling. And sometimes your manager or whoever says like, oh, surely Power BI can easily do that, a running sum. No, it's not that easy. And then of course we have something called quick measures, which allows you to generate DAX for those kind of templates, for like typical business type calculations like a running sum. But again, the DAX it generates, are you really in control? Because it's horrible, the DAX it generates. It's really hard to comprehend, let alone edit and tweak to exactly the result you wanted. So many of us steer clear because it feels uncomfortable. You don't really know and understand what's going on. So that got us thinking. And what if we could turn this whole thing upside down? What if instead of forcing you to define a calculation here in the model, where all the complexity lives, why wouldn't we give you a chance to do a calculation later in the pipeline? Because I didn't finish my pipeline story. So you have the data and the source. You do the transformations, you do the modeling. That's where you define your measures. But then in the end, you're not just loading the data into the model for fun and just be done with it, right? You want to create visuals, right? You want to create a visual, multiple visuals. That's the end state. That's the end of the pipeline. But between the model and the visual, loads of things happen. And one of the biggest things that happens, there's two big things that happen. One is we aggregate the data. Because you might have millions of records in here, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of individual sales records. Your visual is likely not going to show hundreds of millions of records. Most likely your visual will actually show highly aggregated information like total sales by year. That might have been hundreds of millions of individual sales records over here, but the number you're showing here might be just 3 numbers if you are looking at a scope of 3 years. Might have come from 300 individual records. That's not the point. You're showing aggregated information over here. So that's one big thing that happens. And the second thing that happens is when we are painting that visual onto the screen, we have calculated everything within this filter context. So by the time we actually get to the point that we start putting those pixels onto your mobile or web browser or whatever, Power BI has A, aggregated the information, and B, figured out what the calculation context is and applied that and did all the math. So then we are here at the final stage where we are just about to write that visual to your screen, paint it onto the screen. What about if we let you insert a calculation here? The data is aggregated. The filter context has been applied. You can, the complexity is gone. And now here, you can step in and say, wait, just before you paint everything to the screen, I want you to do this extra calculation. Wouldn't that be great? And what if we would then, by doing that, making the DAX that you would have to write very simple, because you don't have to worry about the complexity. And what if maybe you would be able to do all of that without typing, without having to write weird incantations, but maybe just rely on your mouse pointer and point and click to tell us what you want to do? That would be great, right? That is what visual calculations are. Essentially, visual calculations or visual calcs are DAX calculations defined on the visual. So instead of just here in front of the pipeline, the beginning, we give you an opportunity to add calculations here all the way at the end. So that means these DAX calculations are scoped to the visual. They can refer to whatever is on the visual. They cannot reach back to the model. And that's on purpose, because the moment we would allow you to reach back into the model, into the warehouse of all the millions of rows, suddenly you would have to worry about what makes DAX hard again. You would have to worry about filter context and context transition. By us telling you you're in this little sandbox, you cannot reach back out, makes your life so much easier because we gave you blinders. So then these are executed in the scope of the visual. Then you can refer to the visual structure, because now we have a DAX construct that is not visual agnostic. A measure doesn't know if it's on a line chart or a bar chart or a dreaded pie chart. It doesn't know. Here, these calculations do know on what type of visual they are on, so they can actually interact with that. And yeah, they can refer to everything that's on the visual. That's what I already said. And then they are just DAX calculations. So it's not a new language. It's just DAX calculations on that visual. Now, we're not taking away calculated columns. We're not taking away measures. We're basically combining the best of both worlds into visual calculations. So calculated columns are executed row by row over a table, right? That is what visual calculations do by default. You have more flexibility. By default, they go top to bottom over a table. And I'll show you that in a second in the demo. Measures are executed on the fly. Calculated columns are not. They are executed and calculated at data refresh, so the results are stored in the model, which bloats the model. Measures are calculated on the fly when they are needed. That is what visual calculations do. So they do the row by row thing from calculated columns, but they also do the on the fly thing without bloating your model from measures. So it's almost like calculated columns and measures got together and made a baby, and that is what visual calcs are. So I fully expect people to move to visual calcs eventually, not only because it is easier to do, the DAX is easy to write and read and edit and understand and easy to share, but also the performance. We've seen 500% performance increase on average of doing visual calcs versus measures versus calc columns, just because we're not on this low level of data. We're working on the aggregated level of data. 500% performance increase as well. And it's easier to do, it's easier to write and easier to understand, and then you get better performance. What's not to love? And there's tricks you can do that you cannot really do in measures. So what is visual calcs? WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. You will have point and click eventually. You just have to worry about what is in this little box. And then we have a couple things up our sleeve that we will give you high-level functions to work with and allow you to refer to the visual structure. So before we get into the demo, and Tim, I saw your question. I'll park that for after the demo. Before we go into the demo, I want you to have, this is arguably the most important slide. I want you to have one simple mental model. Any visual in Power BI can be represented as a matrix. Any. Give me a bar chart, I can represent it as a matrix. Give me a map, I can represent it as a matrix. Give me something with small multiples, I can represent it as a matrix. And that's the pivotal point for visual calcs. The core idea is we take the visual you're working on, we show you the visual matrix, as we call it, which is the matrix representation of the data that's in the visual. We show you both. So you will see here in the mockup here on the right, you'll see a column chart. And that's 3 groups, which happen to be 3 fiscal years. And then for each group, it has 2 numerical values, sales amount and total product cost. That's the visual. A column chart with 3 groups and 2 bars for each, 2 columns for each group. Very simple. Now, in order for Power BI to paint this visual onto my screen, it needs just 3 rows and 3 columns. It gets that by taking the data from here, aggregating it to the right level. So we actually are now showing you sales amount and total product cost by year. Why is there 3 columns and 3 rows? Well, we have 3 years, and we have a column for year, a column for sales amount, and a column for product cost. And that together allows us to write that visual onto your screen, paint that visual there. That visual matrix is then the data representation of that visual. So that will show you those 3 rows and 3 columns as I described, the aggregated information. At this point, we don't care and we don't know about the hundreds of millions of records that might live here. Because you don't need them anymore. You're in the visual. and then the visual is aggregated. On here now, I can add columns on the visual matrix to do stuff with that aggregated information. Because guess what? You don't need to reach back to the low level information most of the times. If you just wanted to do a simple comparison, you can just use the aggregated information. It's way faster, it's way easier to understand, it's way easier to write, it's way easier to validate that you actually got the results. And that is the core idea of Visual Calcs. So let's go to the demo, and then we can get to some questions. Cool. So you should see my Power BI desktop now, or at least it should show up any second. This is Power BI desktop. I'm not showing you any mock-ups or any fake stuff. This is literally code in our product today. It's simply that you don't have access to it yet. Okay, so this is live code. So this is AdventureWorks, so I'm just gonna get some very simple things going. Sales amount, I'm gonna add total product cost, and I'm just gonna take the fiscal year. And then I'm gonna turn that into a bar chart. Very simple, very straightforward, nothing fancy visual. So I now have a visual sorted by fiscal year. I'm just going to sort it by fiscal year descending, so it kind of makes sense. Sorry, ascending, so the oldest fiscal year is at the top, and then the newest one is at the bottom, right? Makes sense. And then I have sales amount to total product cost for each of the years. Cool. So now, nothing new so far. However, when I select this visual, a button on the ribbon gets enabled. So if I don't have a visual selected, that button is not enabled. And this button allows me to get into Visual Calcs edit mode. What you're looking at now in the product is literally what I just showed you in the mock-up on the screen in the PowerPoint. It is what we call the Visual Calculations edit mode. It is the visual, as I promised, that you selected, and then the visual matrix at the bottom. You can make the comparison. You'll see that the numbers in the visual matrix match what is shown in the visual, right? If you hover over sales amount over here, you see it's over 50 million and a bit, and that's exactly the number that's over here. So these two things match. They are in constant communication. Whenever you update the visual, it will update the visual matrix and vice versa. Make sense? Cool. So now on here, I can actually start adding extra columns, and we call those the visual calculations. So those visual calculations live on the visual matrix and hence are also shown on the visual. And I can work with, as I said, with everything that is inside of my visual matrix. So I can work with sales amount, total product cost, and fiscal year. Nothing else. This is all I can work with. Do I need more? I simply bring it from the model into the visual first, so we can apply the aggregations, we can apply the filter context, and we can add it in. So let me start with something simple. And I'm starting simple on purpose because, just to warm you up. But also, I fully recognize the example that I'm going to give now should have been a measure, but just bear with me. Okay, I'm just going to say profit, and I'm going to say sales amount minus total product cost. Now, a couple of things to note here. I didn't write any tables because at this point, doesn't matter. If it came from 500 tables or one, it doesn't matter. The aggregation has happened. We're now just working in this little sandbox. So I'm just referring to whatever name is that I see here. It's very visual. So, and also, this is almost like a calculated column. So the result is going to be execution row by row. Great. So I'm going to say, okay. And now I have a profit. I subtracted for each year the sales amount minus the total product cost. Very, very simple. Okay, cool. Let's do something more intelligent. Let's say I wanted to compare the profit that I just defined. So I want to take the profit and I want to compare the difference in profit across the years. So I want to say for each year, find the previous year and take that profit and subtract my profit from that, right? So, sorry, subtract that profit from mine. So I do profit minus the previous profit. Any guesses to what the function name would be that I have to use to get the previous profit? Anybody? Maybe
previous.
Previous. Who said that? John? Was that you?
Yes. Yeah.
Have you seen my presentation before or no?
No.
I don't want to cheat either, so I won't say.
No, I haven't, but it seemed very leading the way you were asking the questions.
You are a smart person because I did that on purpose. So thank you for picking up on that. Yes, it is literally just called previous. Look at this. This is DAX, but almost at English. No last year profit or last row or whatever, or pref profit is close enough. But no, this is almost like you're just writing English. You can look at this and go, yeah, I understand what this does. It's profit minus previous profit. Done. Easy. It's not natural language. I just typed DAX, but it feels like natural language because it's so simple. Would this work? Well, of course it would work. I wrote this, so I know this works. And now we have a profit comparison across the years. Okay, let's do something more impressive. Let's do a running sum of profit. Any guesses to the function name for running sum?
Probably running sum.
Let's see. There we go. Running sum of profit. Would this work? Of course it works. I wrote it. This is almost as easy as you need. And no, you don't need ChatGPT to generate that. If you need ChatGPT to generate that, you're not understanding the point. Like, this is that simple that you can just ask anybody to just express what they want and you can just write it. You don't need ChatGPT for this. You would never have to use ChatGPT because ChatGPT would not help you here because this is so simple. You should be able to just do this on your own. Use ChatGPT for the more advanced stuff, a calculator, whatever else. But for this stuff, please don't use ChatGPT. That doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so let's keep going. We have more stuff. We have a template. These are just here to help you to get started. You don't have to use this, but this is just a guiding to discover stuff that you can do. So running sum, we already saw versus previous, but what about average of children, percent of grand total, percent of parent, or maybe a moving average? You want to do a moving average? Any guesses to the function name for moving average? Maybe, I don't know, John, Tim, any idea?
I would name it smooth it out, please.
I went with something else. I just called it moving average. Is that okay?
That works.
Cool. So I'm just going to say moving average for profit, and then 2 for the window size, which basically tells me take 2 years. So what I'm going to get is a moving average of profit. Literally, this is the day that DAX turned easy, because you don't have to know more. This is literally all you need to know to work with this. And this is such a big deviation from everything else that you know today in DAX, where you have to work through all of this and take the training or whatever, and then still not feel comfortable sometimes. This is such a big deviation that you can just do that. So cool. So now let's look at the visual, because I see the visual calcs, great. I see my visual, but I kind of screwed up my visual, right? Because as I said, everything that happens on the visual matrix is also being shown on the visual. As you can see, the visual turned really ugly. What if I only wanted to see the profit versus previous on the visual and then the running sum and the moving average maybe in the tooltips? Well, you would say delete stuff from the visual matrix. But remember, I said the visual calcs can only refer to the stuff that's on the visual matrix. So if I delete sales amount, then profit wouldn't be aware of sales amount anymore. So that would not give any result, would break. Profit versus previous is dependent on that, would break. Running sum profit would break. Moving average would break. So that's not an option. I cannot delete the stuff from the visual matrix. And that's also a good thing, because keeping that around allows me to understand how we got here. So what I can do is, Tom is saying, hide. So I can now use the little eye icon over here that you might recognize from a model view and hide stuff from the visual. So when I start clicking here, you can see the visual matrix isn't changing, but the visual is. I'm now hiding stuff that I don't want to show on the visual from the visual. It's still on the visual matrix, so I can still retrace my steps. I can see how I got to this answer, right? But I can just move things around and keep going until I have the visual that I want. You see, the visual matrix is not changing. It's maybe reordering. That's because where it is in the buckets over on the right, but in effect, it's not changing. The eye icon is exactly there to help you hide this stuff. And now let me exit out. And now I have a visual that didn't exist before, using calculations that were very hard to do, which literally took me a couple minutes to do in single line statements, couple words, almost English. And that's now how easy DAX is. And you can see the difference in profit versus previous, the running sum and the moving average being shown beautifully. Okay, so that wraps up my demo. So let's get back to the slides. I also want to answer some of the questions. I think Tim was asking, when is the filter context debugger coming? Well, Tim, maybe not anytime soon. No, by doing this, you don't actually really need it, right? So we're kind of moving away from that. We're betting on this being the future. You will need filter context debugger at some point. You have external tools for that. I think the reliance on filter context becomes less and less the more we progress. So that's one thing I would like to say with that. And then, so yeah, the questions about the rows. Can we export the visual calc table to CSV? You will be able to export the visual with the visual calcs and all the hidden fields on it to CSV to Excel if you want to. Yes, you can. Tim, you asked the question, select all question mark. What was that? Can you explain?
Oh, I was just wondering, like, okay, if we don't have like an export, can you like, control A it and just paste it into Excel or something like that? But I think I know how to get around it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We maybe should consider doing that. Just like you can do in SSMS, the result set you can basically copy paste easily, right? That's basically what you're thinking.
Yeah, because
okay.
Because sometimes, when I'm with a client and they're like, "Ah, that doesn't look right," and you're like, "Hold on, let me do some totals here for you," and they're like, "Okay, I want to, run my own data validation, and it'd be nice just to send them the spreadsheet and go there."
Yeah, no,
check it
that's
out.
fair. That's fair. We for now have only thought about exporting through like the normal export functionality, but maybe copy paste would be good. I know that's a little bit contentious because we also don't want to make it too easy to export to Excel because we're really trying to educate people not to do that.
Yeah.
In this case, I can see a case for that. So I'll think about it a little bit more, but you can definitely export them using the normal export ways to CSV, for example, to get it into Excel.
Nice.
Yeah.
Jay, I think you're making a good point on the export to Excel because in my experience, what you just demoed is what people do after they export to CSV or Excel, and then finish up the next two steps by doing a running sum or calculation they couldn't do before. And that's irrelevant of the BI tool. It's just in people's mind, you build the framework of the basic calculation you want, then you export to CSV and you're a little bit more comfortable to kind of play around with it, and then add columns to calculate averages and running sums and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then they use that in their presentation. So I think that's a good step to mitigate the two approaches.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the feedback, Arno. Appreciate that. Let's see. Some people like the eye icon, going to be great for clients, blah, blah. How soon is it available? Yeah, that's of course a hot topic question. I'm happy to tell you that Christmas is coming very early this year. Let me just put it that way. If you go look at our public roadmap, it literally says March of this year.
Yeah.
For public preview. So the public preview, the beta test, or whatever you want to call it, the public preview that anybody can get started with this is coming up in March, which is literally next month. So just hold on for a little bit longer. I know we've been at this for years now, and you've all struggled. Well, this is almost here. So March is going to be the moment you can have your hands on this and you can start playing with this on your own. You have to enable it then in desktop. You need to go into the preview settings and say visual calculations. Yes, restart desktop, and then you'll have all of this, what I just showed you. Cool. So does that answer that question? I hope so. If there's more questions, happy to take them now.
So Jay, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I really like visual calculations, and I think it's going to be huge when you roll it out. I was wondering, is it possible that, do you have some way to like right click on it and then create the measure? Like, I do running sum. I'm like, yeah, that's what I need. Or moving average, I right click on it and say create measure from this, so that, I have that available to me for other types of visuals.
So right now, no, but we're definitely thinking through what that would mean. So one of the things that we were considering doing is doing some kind of promotion and allow you to indeed interact with a visual calc and say, store this as a model measure. Now, there's a couple challenges with that. Is we think your expectation would be that we write the DAX for you that is then the exact equivalent of that visual calc, but then in a measure, right? Which would be
Yeah.
a logical expectation.
Yeah.
However, we cannot guarantee that we can actually do that.
Okay.
Because not all visual calcs can be that easily translated into a measure. That's one problem. But even if we left that aside and we said, we'll try our best, but you have to validate it, right? Even if we skipped over that, there's another problem. Is visual calcs are dependent on the visual, right? So when I say go in here, whoops, where's my mouse? When I go in here, if you notice my running sum, for example, let me pull the expression back up. This running sum happens to do a running sum on years for profit. Nowhere in this expression can you see that it wants to do a running sum over year and is only built to do a running sum over year. In fact, if I changed year out and I added something else, I don't know, quarter, of course this will work, because those expressions don't rely on a reference to an exact field. That's the beauty of visual calcs, because it refers to the visual structure under the covers. Now,
So
that's a problem, because the moment you start putting that as a measure, measures live outside of the visual. So we would have to somehow say we capture the current state of the visual, and we're just going to put in the fields as they were right now when you clicked promote to model measure, and we're going to put those fields into the measure expression, right? So then your measure expression would now literally read, do something like running sum profit over year and fiscal quarter, right? Because those things are now the things it runs over. So we would pin the current state in the model measure. I'm not sure if that's the expectation of the user, actually. And that's where we were a little bit hesitant of doing this. But we'll see. But that's definitely an area that we're thinking about. Visual calcs are stored in the visual, they're not in the model. Correct, they are in the visual, they're not in the model. That's on purpose, because the moment we put them back in the model, you have to worry about all the complexity of the model. That's why they're not there. So just to answer that one question. Does that answer your original question about promoting to measures, Tim?
yes. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. And we're thinking through that, right? And also, this is an invitation to you and you all on the call. Once this is here, think about that scenario. What would be your expected behavior if you wanted to store this as something that you can reuse? What would be that story? Is that a promotion to measure? Is that something else? What would it look like? What would that have to do? I want you to give me that feedback, because with that, I can build that right experience for you, because we know this is something you have to answer. We have multiple options on the table. I need your help to pick the right one. So that's also an invitation to you all. How does optimization show up in visual calculations? Ledon, sorry, can you maybe explain your question a little bit more so I can try to answer it?
Sure. I guess the question is, do you have to worry about optimization when you're using visual calculations? I guess is probably the better way to ask it.
Well, most of the time you don't, because, can we safely say that even if I wrote a multi-line DAX statement in here, that arguably it wouldn't be millions of rows in here in this visual matrix, because you would be creating a crazy visualization that nobody would even be able to process in their brains if you had millions of rows in here. Like, that's not what you do. You aggregate here because why do we aggregate? Because we are limited in our brains. We cannot look at millions of rows and understand trends. You have to aggregate stuff. So if that assumption holds true, then the number of rows in here will be limited to maybe, let's say, maximum 5,000 rows. I think that would be a very complicated visual, but maybe. Let's just run with that number for now. Okay? 5,000 rows is what we kind of expect the maximum number of rows to be here. I think we can safely assume that whatever complicated DAX you write, Power BI will be more than capable of doing those calculations on 5,000 rows of data. It has shown many times over, it can do very complex calculations on millions and hundreds of millions of rows, right? So doing that same complicated calculation on 5,000 rows is peanuts. So therefore, do you have to worry about optimization? No, not as much. In fact, if you copy the same code from a measure into a visual calc, you can see, because it runs on aggregated data, 500% performance increase on average. So yes, of course you have to worry about it, but not as much as with measures where you can easily shoot yourself in the foot. So that's really, I hope that kind of answers that kind of question.
Thank you. Which, so the visual calculations are really tied to certain visuals.
Yes.
When you plan to roll it out in March, which visuals are you thinking of? Obviously, bar charts, you know, stack charts.
Look at the
seem
screen.
To be, what's that?
Look at the screen. You can see it. Those are the visuals that will support in March.
I gotcha. So you disable the ones that are not going to be.
The ones that are not going to be available in March are disabled. Now, custom visuals will work. In the end, all visuals will work, but there's a few built-in visuals that we simply don't necessarily know how this should work yet. We'll figure it out, but we're getting started on this preview in March, so we'll have some time to figure that out. And then custom visuals will work, but it might depend on the custom visual author to do some extra work for us, right? It's out of our control, really. But we give them everything they need to use visual calcs on their, to enable others to use visual calculations on their custom visual. So we're not stopping anybody there. It's just that some things we haven't figured out, like the scatter plot is really hard yet. The maps are hard because there's an API issue there. Something with the combo chart that makes it hard. Like the AI visuals are kind of tough still to build. We simply haven't done the work. We have a plan for all built-in visuals, but we simply haven't completed the work yet. So that's the answer to that question.
Thank you.
So Selenia, is asking, will these functions only be available in Visual Calcs? That's a great question. The functions I showed you, yes, they will only be available in Visual Calcs. And the reason is because they actually work because they're relying on the visual structure. I haven't shown you that yet, but I can lift up the veil a little bit so you can see what's happening. So when I write running sum of profit, I actually have a second parameter here that is set by default, which you don't have to set, you don't see it, but you can see it, and you might have to change it depending on the scenario you're doing. And that's what we call an axis. And the default axis is rows. And you can see with the little icon here, if you pay close attention, it's downwards pointing arrows. So read the word rows here as across the rows. That is the default value. Depending on the visual you're in, you can also have across the columns, which it goes left to right across the columns horizontally. Makes sense? But by default, this is set to rows. That's why I didn't show you that. So any function that has axes on it as a parameter will be available in Visual Calcs. And if that function, its signature has axis as its only signature, then that function is only available in Visual Calcs. There are functions that also have another signature, which doesn't include axis. Those functions are the window functions and some other functions. You can also use those in measures and calculated columns. So there's going to be a whole bunch of functions like SumX and AverageX and stuff like that, CountX, that you can do in measures, calculated columns, and Visual Calcs, because they're going to get a signature that includes axis, so you can actually put them in here. But there's also going to be a few functions that are only going to be Visual Calcs only, like running something moving average. So I hope that kind of answers your question, Celia.
It does. Thank you.
Yep. So that leads me to the next one. Let's talk about that. So visual calculations, what are they? They are DAX calculations in the scope of a visual. And on top of that, we're giving you new functions and new concepts. Why is this important? Well, it's just DAX. So most DAX will work. Things that relate to the model won't work. Remember, we aggregated the model away from you, so you don't have use relationship or related table. That doesn't exist. You can't use those. You just get an error because you're outside of the model. But something like an order category switch, which switch true as on the slide now, will just work. Basic arithmetic will work. CountX, SumX, AverageX will work. Not a problem. Calculate will work. Then you get new functions. Why is this important? Well, you know, for example, if you compare doing a running sum today using the regular DAX, here's the answer that I would have to do, which is calculate sum filter all selected is on or after max. And then at the bottom of the slide is the one-line solution in Visual Calcs. Am I making sense yet that this is great and easier? Well, maybe take another one. Given a list of states and a number of restaurants per state, for each state, calculate the difference in number of restaurants for that state versus the state above it. If you wanted to do that using regular DAX, what's on the left is what you would have to write. I didn't write this. I got stuck. I asked Jeffrey Wang, the inventor of DAX, and he typed this for me. Perfect DAX without any help in Notepad. It was awesome. It was a sight to see, a thing to behold, including a trick with top N1, which I would never have dreamt up. And a summarize and all selected value, top N1, a filter, temporary tables, and then finally a SumX. Horrific stuff, but it works. Now, the situation got slightly better. In December 2022, we shipped something we called window functions. You might have noticed those, and you might have thought to yourself, what are those people doing over at Microsoft? Why are they building this? And I think by now, hopefully you start piecing together the answer, and otherwise I'll tell you in a second. So with window functions, this situation becomes slightly easier because window functions has a function called offset, which is a relative movement in a certain direction. See where this is going? Okay, so the same expression using window functions is now calculate number of restaurants. We're now on the right side of the screen. Number of restaurants offset -1, move one up on state, and then order it by state. And then return the difference between the current number of restaurants minus the previous number of restaurants. Relatively easy compared to the original DAX. But then Visual Calcs, one line, almost English. Number of restaurants minus previous of number of restaurants. This is so easy. Why does this work this way? It's because when we shipped window functions, you were maybe thinking, what are they doing? We didn't show you, or I didn't show you, the house that I was building. I was only showing you the individual Lego bricks that I was using. I didn't show you the house that I was building on top. So these Visual Calcs functions are actually shortcuts to the window functions. So previous is just a shortcut to calculate offset -1 with the right parameters filled out. Running sum is just a shortcut to the window function, which is also part of the window functions, which then with the right parameters filled out. So these are simple to use versions of the window functions, which also means that most Visual Calcs you can express as a window function. Hence, going back to Tim's question, can you store this as a measure? Most Visual Calcs you will be able to store as a measure because we can express them as a window function, right? So the window functions are the low-level functions. They provide the most flexibility, but also the hardest to use. Then we have medium-level functions, which are the shortcuts, offset, previous, next, first, and last. I only show you previous, but of course there's a next Of course there's a first. Of course there's a last. And that kind of stuff. And then the high level functions are really easy, running sum and moving average. That's kind of like how this house was being built. So the window functions are offset, index, window, rank, row number, supporting functions, order by, partition by, match by. If you don't know what these are, if you're interested in them, go learn them today, because they will help you in your Visual Calcs journey, if only to understand what the shortcuts are doing. You don't need them to write Visual Calcs, but if you want to really understand what Visual Calcs are and how they actually work under the covers, this is what you need to learn. And then the medium level functions are previous. I showed you that. Next, opposite direction, first and last. So previous is a shortcut to offset -1, move up. Next is a shortcut to offset +1, move 1 down. First is a shortcut to index, index 1, get to the first one. Last is a shortcut to index -1, get to the last one. And then we have lattice navigation functions we haven't even talked about, but average of children requires you to navigate hierarchies. And you can now use expand to temporarily, for your calculation, add more detail. So if you're doing an average of children, you can say average sales expanding down to month, if that's your child, right? Or even expanding down to the next child. That is what expand would do. And then if you have year, quarters, and month, well, for year, the childs are quarters. So then we can take the average of the quarter. For quarters, the childs are months. So then we take the average of the month. Average of children calculation. Very simple. Expand all is go down to the leaf level and get me that level of detail, whatever it may be. And then we have collapse and collapse all, which is the opposite direction. So I'm on the lowest level. I want to get a percentage of parent. I do divide my current sales by the collapsed of sales to my parent. Collapse. Parent, give me that sales. I'm going to calculate the percentage of the sales that my sales made in compared to the parent's sales. So, and then collapse all is basically get me the grand total. Move up all the way. And then we have a range function, which is an easier to use function of window to get a slice of the data. And then finally, we have running sum and moving average as the high level functions, which we already talked about. So that's all you really need to know about the functions that we're going to deliver. Do you have a reference chart for the Visual Calcs to refer to? Do you have a reference chart for the Visual Calcs to? Joe, I don't necessarily understand your question, to be honest. Are you asking for documentation or a list of functions, or what's on your mind? Okay, so documentation will be there. It's not there yet because, well, the feature is not public yet. So the moment it goes public, that documentation will be there. You will see a list of functions, you will see the parameters, you'll get examples, you get everything you need. But right now, we simply haven't published it yet because the function is not public yet. And we don't want people to go try to use running sum somewhere and go like, that doesn't work. So, Selenia, no, that's not why we were building that. Most people thought that's why we were building window functions, but no. We were literally just showing you the Lego bricks I was playing with to build this house with. And let me be very clear. I'm only getting started. This is just the first layer. If you take a step back and start thinking, there's more stuff that you can do on top of this. Like, what about custom totals? With these Lego bricks that are called Visual Calcs in hand, can I suddenly do something to figure out on which level I am in the visual? With collapse, move somewhere and say, if I'm here, do this, and otherwise do this? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. But we simply have to build it. So expect this house that we've now built on the foundation of window functions that I'm showing you today. You might think this is a 2-story house. It will very quickly turn into a skyrise or a high-rise, right? It will turn into extra layers on top of this because now we have built the plumbing, the foundational work to add more interesting features on top of this, like custom totals, like other stuff that people have been asking for years now. You wanted the top end versus others? We can now start building that because we now have the plumbing that we had to build for this first 2 layers of the house. So we're only getting started. This is now a 1-family home. It's going to turn into a high-rise very soon. That's the goal, at least. So hopefully that kind of explains how these things were interacting. Cool. So 6 on my end. We still have 20 minutes max, I think, right, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's a a slushy kind of ending time.
Sure.
Sometimes we get people that ask a lot of questions. It's all good.
I'm happy to take more questions. I can also melt your brains a little bit more with axes details. That's all fine, but also happy to just have a conversation about it. So Miguel asked, what are the trade-offs of implementing only this approach? Performance risks? Well, no. Performance would actually be way better than measures. The trade-off would be that today, without a proper reuse story of visual calcs across visuals, you would have to, if you wanted to have the same running sum in multiple visuals, you would have to repeat the same logic every single time, which is cumbersome and annoying if you want to make a change. So we have to figure some kind of reuse story out. We don't have any yet. So that's then the trade-off you're making if you want to jump in right now. Also, what I want to say is this is going to be a preview. So I want you to start jumping in and start playing with this and give us your feedback, but don't build your whole career on this because this is a preview, right? It's not GA. So that's another thing to say. But yeah, kind of maintenance issues in the long term are where the issue is right now without the reuse story. Can I show a calc that uses the column axis? Well, Tom, in fact, I can. And for that to happen, I have to melt your brain a little bit. So let's keep going in the slides. Okay, so we have new concepts. I introduced visual matrix to you, right? The thing that shows the visual, but then the matrix. And then a concept called axes, which is now where we're headed. And then there's reset, which basically defines while this. Okay, so for me to explain that, let me first say exactly what axis is. So axis defines how the calculation traverses the visual matrix. By default, it goes from top to bottom, right? It can also go left to right. It can also do interesting other stuff. We'll get to that. Reset says while the calculation is traversing from top to bottom or from left to right, while it's doing that, pay close attention to the values of the columns that we're traversing or the rows that we're traversing. And if something happens, maybe you want to restart your calculation while you're moving top to bottom. So let's say we have years and quarters. We have multiple years, and you write a running sum of sales. What would happen? It would take the number for Q1 for the first year, add it to Q2 for the second year, return that value, keep going. For Q4, the first year will take the total of the first quarter. Great, as expected. Q1 for the next year, so we switch from December to January, Q1, what it would do is it would take the previous result, the Q4 value, and add the Q1 for the next year. And happily keep going top to bottom because that's what you told it to do. Running sum of profit on rows. Rows is being implicit, top to bottom. That's probably not what you wanted because most business users actually kind of implicitly mean, well, I want you to do the running sum on quarters within the year. Then when the year changes, I want you to restart your calculation, and then the number for Q1 for the next year should just be the Q1 number for that year. Don't keep summing the Q4 number to the Q1 number again. Reset is your friend. You can then say running sum, profit, reset, year, which basically reads as whenever year changes the value from whatever it is now where I'm in to something else, I'm going to start over from zero. That's what reset is. That's all there is to know about reset. And then it also has like lowest parent, the highest parent, so you can do more intelligent stuff. But it's basically like that. Think about it as like, when something happens, I'm going to restart. And I'm describing what should happen. And if that happens, that's when I restart my calculation. Then direction is a combination of those things, which is just a concept that you have to kind of keep in mind. We'll see that in just a sec. And then hidden I already showed you. So that's the last concept, just the ability to hide something from the visual matrix, from the visual, but it's still shown on a visual matrix. Okay, so now for the brain melting part, because some people are asking for it. I showed you rows as the direction, top to bottom. That's the default. We also have columns. I already told you that. Left to right. But then you can also combine these two, and here's the brain melting part, to do something called columns rows, which would instruct the Visual Calc to go across the rows first, and then move down as a typewriter or a snake across your visual. So go horizontally first, left to right. When you arrive at the end of the first row, go to the first cell, the first column of the second row, keeping in mind the result that you had here, and keep going. As a snake. Flip it 90 degrees, you can do rows, columns. You can go down to the first column and then go to the first cell of the second column and keep going, like a planter or whatever this motion is. I don't know. I call it a planter, like something that plants in the ground. I don't know if somebody comes up with a better word, but that's how I think about it. Then, of course, while doing this, while this snake or typewriter or this planter moves over your visual, you can now use reset to say, well, while you're doing this, if you ever reach a different region, start over from 0. So then your calculation becomes very interesting because you can do all these kind of interesting movements across your matrix. To show you this visually, here you go. So now we have a very simple one. It's a matrix visual, and hence the visual matrix is a matrix with multiple directions. First, sales amount on rows. We're starting easy. This should start making sense by now, right? Rows, you read it as top to bottom, across the rows. So this means for each row in each column, retrieve the first sales amount from the first row, but execute this in columns separately. So if you look closely to my slide, if you look at the colors, you'll see there's 2018, 2019, 2020 on the columns. There's category on rows. What is happening is that each column has the calculation field on it, and that is then being executed within the column, right? So for each column, for each year, we get the first sales amount, which happens to be the sales amount for accessories within that year, right? So the dashed lines refer to the solid lines. You can see the color coding. You can see how it works, okay? Yes, I know exactly. Tableau with the table calculations does this as well. So now we can do a 90 degrees turn. Columns. Now we're doing the same thing as I said before, but instead of going top to bottom across the rows, we're now going left to right across the columns. Makes sense, right? So now what happens? For each column, retrieve the first sales amount from the first column. So now we're looking at accessories. So and see the color coding again? The dashed lines refer to the solid lines. So now we're looking at getting the sales amount from the first year in each category. Okay, so you can see how this works. 90 degree turn from before. You still with me there? Cool. Brain melt time. Now we're going to get to rows, columns. I'm going to take a different example because it's slightly easier to understand. Previous. We already saw previous. Previous sales amount, rows, columns. This means for each cell, retrieve the previous sales amount from the row above it or from the last cell in the previous column. This is different from just rows. Look at the visual here. So I have, let me just get a laser pointer so I can easily point it out. So you can have, oh, maybe do I have a pen or something? Let me check. Draw some stuff maybe even. Where is it? Pen. So, okay. So we have the pen. Where are you? Hello? No pen? Oh, okay. Yeah, so this refers to that, right? Makes sense. This refers to that. Makes sense. This refers to that. Makes sense. This is empty. Why is that empty? Well, there's no row above me, which is to be expected with rows. And if I just left it like there, it would be expected. But there's also no column to the left of me. So it tried to look for rows. It's nothing there. There's also no column to the left of me, so I'm returning empty. But this, if I just wrote rows, this would have been empty because there's no row above me. But since I wrote rows, columns, it will look at the row and say, oh, there's no row. But since you said rows, columns, I can now take this guy from the previous column and keep going. So this is like the planter movement across your visual. Okay, next slide. 90 degree turn. previous sales amount, columns, rows. For each cell, retrieve the previous sales amount from the column to the left of it or from the last cell of the previous row. Look at the color coding again. Okay, so we're going horizontally first. If only I could find my pen, my digital pen. Hello. Oh, there we are. Okay, sorry about that. This one, empty. Why? Well, there's no column to the left of me. There's no row above me, so I cannot do anything. This one, well, there's a column to the left of me, so get me that value. This one, well, there's a column to the left of me, so get me that value. This one, well, there's no column to the left of me, but since you said columns, rows, I don't have to return blank, so I will just get this guy. Then, of course, this yellow one gets the value from here, because there's a column to the left of me. Very, very simple, once you understand this. So it's very powerful. You can do loads of things in here. Now, let me be very honest. We don't really expect you to use columns, rows, and rows, columns that much. It's there because we can. For completionist sake, we know some examples where customers want to do this, but honestly, 95% of the time, rows and columns are all you need. But there are specific situations in which you might need them. This is a very bad example, but if you had years at the top and then Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 on the rows, then this would start making sense because now you could like do a rolling moving average across rows, across quarters, right? So you could say a rolling moving average across all the years that we have in our data set and or in our visual and all the quarters individually. And now I can calculate a moving average by doing rows, columns, for example, to move over that like that. Or if I did a 90-degree turn, columns, rows. So also we know that Tableau has this as well. And we also know that most Tableau users never ever do these two things. They call it across, then down, and down, then across, I think. Nobody ever uses that. It's just across or down in their case, which we call rows or columns. So we show you the little icons in our UI. You will see these icons. I already showed you that for rows. The moment you start have a visual that also has columns, you can then use columns. You can then also use columns, rows, and rows, columns. So you'll see these icons that I showed you here on the top right of the slide. They are literally how you would show it in a product. So you don't have to remember every time what this does. You can just look at the icon and go like, oh yeah, now I kind of understand what this does, okay? So then when you combine that with reset, where you can do something like, by default, it's never restarting. You can say restart on a certain field, to say restart on every year, reset, or lowest parent or highest parent, which basically means whenever my parent changes values, my immediate parent or my ancestor, how high that up is, whenever that changes, I want to reset. Or you can even say, I want to reset on the nth level above me. So I don't want to restart on my parent, but on my grandparent. So that would be a reset of 2. And if I want to start, and let's say there's a, whatever the word is, parent of the grandparent, ancestor, let's put it that way. I can either say like reset 3, or I can just say, doesn't matter how many levels are there between me and that person or that level, just call it highest parent. And that's then the one that we're going to reset on. So combining these two things gets you loads of things to play with, because now we're at the level of direction where you have columns, rows, rows, columns, rows, columns with reset, rows with reset, columns, rows with reset, and rows, columns with reset. So those are then all the values that you have. Now here we are at the lowest level of knowledge that you need to have about the Visual Calcs, because this is not easy. I give you that. But once you wrap your head around this, you'll know everything there is to know about Visual Calcs. The only thing that would stand in your way of complete mastery of this is if you want to go one level deeper, is window functions. But that is arguably not just Visual Calcs. It's also measures and calculated columns. Cool. So with that, we've got about 8 minutes left. I think it's about time that I stop talking. I might incriminate myself any further. And I'll just officially show the questions slide. And also shout out to DAX memes on Twitter, because they, this visual is awesome. Like, this meme is great. What DAX felt like, now we get Visual Calcs, right? Which is, I think, a reference to whatever the movie with the, I lost the title of the movie, but you know what it is. So yeah, shout out to them for doing that. I don't know who that is, but they're great. Okay, well, 8 minutes and counting. Awesome, anything else?
Any other questions for Jay? You guys have asked some really great questions.
Yeah, but this is your chance. If you want to ask something else, I don't know how often you get a chance to ask to talk to a Power BI program manager, but I can assume it's not every day. So yeah, if there's anything, happy to answer.
Nothing?
Well,
Well,
then either it was completely clear, which I don't think is true, or it was completely irrelevant, which hopefully it's not true either.
oh, not at
So
all.
maybe somewhere in the middle.
Jay, I think you melted our brains is what happened. That last little bit there with the snaking
Yeah.
rows and columns. I was trying to keep up with you.
I'll add to this because it's, I made a comment about my Tableau friends mentioning it. Tableau friends, including myself, because I did some Tableau before.